Okay. Hi, this is James Connolly for Sustainable Dish. This is a really interesting book. This is a book that should be out pretty soon. Actually, we just talked to it. It's out now. I'd sort of come across it on the Twitterverse and became very excited about this. One of the interesting elements of this, and I've studied agriculture for close to a decade. And if you're growing up in the United States, you learn about the history of slavery in myriad forms, primarily centered around cotton production. But you'll hear about it within tobacco production. And then as sort of a side note, you sort of start to hear about it in terms of sugar production. I remember watching the film 12 Years a Slave, and it chronicles a northern African American person who was actually stolen into the slave trade and immediately ends up down in Florida working the sugarcane fields, and then ends up in the cotton production system afterwards. And I think it's one of the first times I had seen in popular culture, in movies, sugar production, cane production actually being shown on TV. It probably was in Roots in the 70s. I'm sure it was, but I was probably about 4 years old at the time. But I wanted to kind of start out. I have Ulbe Bosma on here, and he just wrote a book called The World of Sugar, How the Sweet Stuff Transformed Our Politics, Health, and Environment Over 2,000 Years. And I wanted to just kind of start out with, I had just come back from a trip down to Florida into a place called Bone Valley. And it was in preparation for an interview I had done with somebody on the book called, it's primarily about phosphorus, one of the three primary key ingredients in fertilizer production. And 70% of it actually comes from this one place in Central Florida. And the ecological cost of a lot of the production that is happening within that has had all of this sort of downstream effects within the waterways and river systems that are sort of key components of Florida tourism. What you're finding is massive algal blooms that are part of the process of phosphorus production, but then also secondary as a process of sugar production, which is a huge economic element in Florida alone. And so you have these $7 million homes that can no longer be sold because you get these horrible, smelly, like vomit-inducing water pollutants that are part of our agricultural production system today. Sugar seems to be at the forefront of a lot of that stuff, especially within places in and around that area, Florida, Texas Panhandle, and everything like that. And so this book comes out at a time when I think I actually probably needed it the most, because I needed sort of an overall landscape of the world of sugar as it's been sort of commoditized and made into the modern industry that we deal with today. So thank you so much for coming on and writing this exactly when I needed this.
Okay, my pleasure.
So you had this quote in an article that you had written in before this book had come out, and I think it's a really good lead-in for this. It says, "Sometimes what is most common is most remarkable. For those of us living in a city or suburb, a typical day starts with rising from cotton sheets, hopping into the shower for a quick wash with some palm oil-based soaps, dressing in cotton, shirts and pants, drinking a hot beverage, coffee or tea, and then eating a sugary cereal or jam, sometimes followed by soy-fed processed meat sandwiches wrapped in fossil fuel plastic." So how did we get here?
Yeah, well, this is an article I wrote together with my colleague Sven Beckers, who wrote a well-known book, The Empire of Cotton. So now I come up with my book about the world of sugar. I think it's the same kind of philosophy, trying to understand our world, the workings of capitalism, through the lens of a single commodity, which has immense advantage. We can cross national boundaries, that we are across ages and still are able to present a coherent story. So this is the one commodity which keeps everything together and connects the different nodes in the world, connects our own human bodies, the obesity problem, with environmental destruction, with gross exploitation of human labor. Slavery is, of course, a critical example here, critical case here. 2/3 of all people who were transported across the Atlantic from Africa ended up at sugar plantations. So this is quite a story that can be told through the lens of one single commodity. And of course, that was the attraction to me to write this book.
Yeah, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you had this remarkable quote in the book that I just found absolutely stunning. You make the case that in the way that the 20th century had become the oil and fossil fuel century, the 19th century was primarily run by sugar. And that's a bold claim. And I think I mean, you definitely go through this in myriad detail. But tell us how we got there. How we get from this sort of this grass that can be taken and harvested, and within 48 hours it starts to rot. It can sort of draw me a timeline in some ways from that sort of eastern direction of the production of this one sort of grass. Maybe we can sort of work up into the 19th century, but I find it utterly fascinating.
Yeah, well, the whole story starts probably 3,000 years ago or so in India, where farmers discovered how they can crush cane, get the juice out of it, then boil the juice into kind of thickened mass. It's a kind of dark brown, even almost black mass, which is not the nice crystalline sugar, which is our table sugar, which we have today, until let's say 500 after Christ, that people in India or in Persia, we do not know exactly, discovered how to get crystalline sugar out of this boiling sugar mass, this syrup. They had to put alkaloids in it. They have to do something with lime or with egg white or whatever to make this juice crystallize. So over time, this whole process became more and more sophisticated. They invented all kinds of mills, all kinds of procedures to refine it further into a kind of white powdery sugar. Now we're talking about 1,000 after Christ, and sugar was only available at that stage in China, in India, in Egypt, but not yet in Europe. The Europeans didn't know anything about sugar at the time of the Roman Empire. So sugar was a product that was there, but it was very expensive. It was very difficult to make. So it was something only for the highest aristocracy, for the emperors and the kings. And only over time during the European Middle Ages, you see that the Europeans become acquainted with sugar. And but the problem with Europeans was that Europe was too cold to grow sugarcane. So it could only be done in the Mediterranean basin, so on the island of Cyprus or Sicily or the southern coast of Spain. So what happens when Europe learned to love sugar, as I say in my book, when Europe learned to love sugar, they had to go elsewhere to obtain it. Africa was not an option because the African soil and climate was not conducive to sugar plantations. So they went first to the islands off the coast of Africa, Madeira, the Canary Islands, Sao Tomeo. And then with Columbus, when he went to Cuba, his ships had already cane stalks in their hulls, and they started to plant sugar in the Americas. So in Cuba first, and then Portuguese started sugar production in Brazil, and their whole history, gruesome history of plantation slavery starts. And I think it's important to underline that half to 2/3 of all people, as I said, transported from Africa ended up in the sugar plantations. And one of the reasons is that the sugar plantations, the conditions there were absolutely dreadful, were abhorrent. People had to work there for very long days. The conditions in the field were very dangerous. The cane rots indeed in 48 hours, so it had to be harvested very quickly and then processed very quickly. So the people in the mills had to work for another 18 hours per day to get the harvest done. People had to carry manure to the fields, which also caused all kinds of diseases. And then I have not yet mentioned the pure sadism of the overseers. So the conditions at the sugar plantations were worse than all other plantations, including cotton or tobacco or rice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the one of the things that you do a very good job of going through is the process by which you make this commodity, this transportable commodity that can then be used and transported all over the world. The two main problems, meaning the rot that happens that very quickly, but then the fermentation that'll happen to the juice as well. And so you're talking somewhere 18 hours a day that people are working, boiling this, turning it into a crystalline form so that it can be transported and is transportable. Yeah, I think that there were so many elements of this. I had picked up Sidney Mintz's book. I picked it up years ago, and it had sort of gone through just reevaluating a lot of the stories from there. But the degree of terror involved, I think, within either the sort of chattel slavery element of it, or even just the indentured servitude, which I just consider to be slavery in and of itself. There were so many elements of this that became integral to the production of this thing that then became by the 19th century, it become ubiquitous. Could be afforded by middle-class families and eventually by the poor. And just the level to which the numbers, the poundage of sugar that ended up in Europe is just so stunning to me.
Yeah, well, what happened was that in the course of the 18th century, people discovered how machines could help to produce sugar. So the age of steam and steel, which we usually associate with Europe and the United States, was also there in the sugar plantations very early on. So what we see in the early 19th century is that steam-driven cane crushers entered the fields with the hundreds. I mean, the huge numbers of cane crushers. So the industrialization of the sugar sector did not happen so much in Europe. In fact, it started at the spot where the cane was harvested. And that's precisely because cane is rotting within 48 hours. Now, from then on, you can see that thanks to industrialization and thanks to the fact that that slavery continued throughout the much of the 19th century, that indentured labor came, which means that workers were contracted in China and in India and brought over to the Caribbean region. These huge amounts of forced labor enabled the sugar producers to produce increasing quantities of sugar for the European market. And the Dutch did their part by introducing a forced cultivation system in Java, which imposed an obligatory or forced cultivation of cane by Javanese peasants for European sugar millers. That enabled Java to become the second largest sugar producer after Cuba. And Cuba, slavery in Cuba was only abolished in 1886. So this is what 19th century shows us, a story of staggering volumes of sugar that became available for European American markets, but much of it was based upon forced agricultural labor.
Yeah, I've been reading a little bit of work in terms of cotton production in the 19th century. There have been a lot of scholarship that's happened over the past 20 or 30 years that sort of push back against the sort of the mechanization of cotton production. And they talk a lot about how the Industrial Revolution created, in some ways, that less of a need for chattel slavery, less of a need for industrial indentured servitude and stuff like that, because you would now you could make all of these different parts of the production process mechanical. I think a lot of that scholarship has been pushed back on now, especially within Black scholars who say that really the cotton gin had very little influence on the need and the production increases that we saw in the 19th century. Most of it was terror. I wonder if you can kind of talk about that.
Absolutely, because I think that's a tragedy of industrialization. In the early 19th century, people thought that industrialization would make an end to put an end to this arduous manual labor. So the steam and steel would liberate mankind from this horrible work. But the problem was that the industrialization increased the demand for sugar in the industrial centers of the world dramatically. On the other hand, in the fields, it was completely impossible to mechanize the harvesting of cane or to mechanize the harvesting of cotton. So this mechanization of cotton or cane harvesting, that's something of the later part of the 20th century. So it's only after the Second World War that the mechanical cane harvesters entered the cane fields. And then only in the wealthiest part of the world. So the first part the first region where they entered was in Louisiana during the Second World War, when there was a severe shortage of labor, or in Hawaii, or in Australia, but not in India. Even today in India or in Brazil, there's quite a lot of cane cutting, which is still done manually. So the whole story of the industrialization, liberating mankind from slavery, from forced labor, from underpaid labor, from exploitation, that was a dream that vanished by the mid-19th century.
Yeah, and I think that there is, we see that within our entire agricultural system. I think, I don't know how much you followed the roboticization that is sort of happening within agricultural fields, where they're trying to develop technologies to be able to pluck strawberries and blueberries off of the vine. These sort of promises.
Well, this is quite important because it's a kind of artisanal affair, this whole agriculture, apples, pears, strawberries. So you need cheap labor, and there's usually immigrant labor. And the whole story of cheap labor, immigrant labor, is the story of people coming from Mexico to go to California today. But there's also a story that existed 100 years ago in California. People from Mexico came to work in the beet fields or to work in the beet fields of Michigan, etc. So the whole idea that you need a lot of labor to do this manual work, but in fact you don't want these laborers to become part of your nation, is also part of this book. So this is also a story about agricultural seasonal labor. And the same tragedies that occurred with the Mexicans in the United States in beet fields also occurred with Polish laborers in Germany, which were in fact kind of indentured labor. They were not allowed to change from employer. I talk about the Polish laborers in Prussia or in Eastern Germany. They were sent back after the season to Poland. So they were really seasonal labor under the control, under the tutelage of their employers. And of course, they had not much of a negotiating power anymore then in such a situation. So this whole idea that you can mechanize agriculture, it's of course true to a certain extent. You can mechanize the haulage, you can mechanize the processing of cane, and that has been done very, very successfully, or beets for that matter. But mechanization of every aspect for many agricultural products, it was impossible. And for sugar, it was only possible to do that at the turn of, let's say, the later part of the 20th century.
Yeah, and I think we're finding that more and more. There's an article in preparation for this interview that I found on the. I'm unfamiliar with how to say their name. Fanjuel, the Florida, the Cuban American.
Fanjuel, Fanjuel, yes.
Yeah. The Fanjuel family, primarily labor conditions in the Dominican Republic, where they have a lot of their agricultural production, just in absolutely horrific conditions, even in 2022.
Yeah. Yeah, there has been a lot of protest, and people have tried to expose this. And as I wrote, one filmmaker who tried to do this was barred from the Miami Film Contest.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the Serrano, in Serrano. So this is something which is really problematic. And again, the Van Zuls or the Ficinis, another family, wealthy sugar producing family in the Dominican Republic, they are facing low sugar prices, a race to the bottom of the sugar prices. So they have no, well, they can stop, they can do something else, but if they want to continue producing sugar in the Dominican Republic, they have only one option, that's to squeeze on labor cost as much as possible. So, of course, they are morally responsible for what they are doing, but we also have to look at how the global sugar market is warped. I mean, there's so much overproduction on the one hand, there's so much protection that the world sugar market is severely distorted. It's a bit better now because the European Union was stopped from sugar dumping by the World Trade Organization. But still, the international sugar market is warped, and it has been warped for the past 150 years.
Yeah, can you explain that term, sugar dumping?
Yeah, the sugar dumping, that is something which started when Europe began to produce beet sugar. And that started in the 19th century, from the days of Napoleon, when cane sugar did not longer come in Europe. Some geniuses discovered how to extract sugar from beetroot. So this became a prospering industry in Europe, and became even more important for Europe when steel ships with wheat from the Americas came to Europe and ruined the European wheat market. So the European farmers had to switch to another crop, and that was beetroot to produce sugar. But soon, within a few decades, there was a tremendous overproduction of beet sugar. So what they did, the Germans and French, but the Germans in particular, was to impose a tax on their own consumption. And with these taxes, they subsidized their exports. So what happened, that was in fact that the Germans paid for the cheap sugar, which landed on the kitchen dishes of the British. And this whole thing of sugar dumping became part of the common agricultural policies of the European Union after the 1950s. So the idea was that the European Union guaranteed a fixed price for European farmers until a certain volume. And above this volume, there was no longer a guaranteed price, no longer subsidies, but well-organized farms and well-organized factories could use the subsidies which they got for the allowed quotum to dump sugar against a much lower price on the world market. And that's what happened. So in the late 1990s, Europe dumped about, I think, 5 million tons of sugar per year, which has a severe downward effect, of course, the world sugar prices. And to add to this disaster, in the 1980s, the high fructose corn syrup came become increasingly popular also among the beverage industry in the United States, which is made from maize, from corn, and was also sweetener, and led to another downward effect on the prices of sugar on the world market. So these two developments in the United States and in Europe led to a severe pressure on the world sugar prices, which ruins sugar industry in Cuba, for example, but that's also severe consequences in the sugar producing regions in Brazil, in India, in Thailand, and Australia. Yeah. So it was only in 2005 that the World Trade Organization put an end to this dumping by the European Union after litigations of Australia and Thailand and Brazil.
It's amazing to me. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, it's a story. I try to explain this. This is a story which is not something of the past few decades. It's a story which really started in the 19th century, with, well, that's the globalization of food production, the fact that you can transport wheat and sugar across the globe in huge quantities, which leads to, well, a kind of interaction of agricultural markets. As such, in a completely Smithian world, in a beautifully equal playing field for everyone, would work very well, and I think would be the best of all worlds. But as usually, governments are there also to protect their special interest groups, and particularly if the special interest groups encompass hundreds of thousands of farmers that grow sugar beets. So this is of course, foods production is something which is not a free market, and which most national governments would not consider a free market, because the population needs to be fed, and needs to be fed against stable and not too high prices, because it's a sufficient supply and a stable supply of food is of course the basis of your economy and enables you to industrialize, for example. So this is what we're seeing now. This is the food policies of national governments that warp international food markets, and also the case of sugar has led to severe overproduction. And well, this overproduction all ends up in our bodies.
Right. Yeah. So we often talk about this with friends. When you go to the supermarket, are you in awe and also horror at what you see in front of you?
Oh yes. Well, you don't need to go to the supermarket. You can go to your own kitchen and get all the packaged stuff from the shelves. Have a look at it, and you see that there's sugar almost everywhere.
Yeah.
And the food industry and the sugar industry are of course allies in this. For the food industry, sugar gives texture to the food items. It's a way to conserve food. You get the fibers out of the food and the sugar in, and you can keep it longer on the shelves. Yeah. So this is a story of packaged food, of a food industry that also starts in the late 19th century with the urbanization and I think a kind of delinking the production of food and the consumption of food. There's no longer in the same place. You have people who are consuming food that is produced thousands of miles away, and have become, of course, increasingly so in over the past 150 years. And interestingly enough, and that has Sidney Mintz in his book Sweeten and Power also detailed, that sugar is one of the first items that were part of the European households and American households in the course of the 18th century. Foods that came from thousands of miles away. And there's a really globalization of foods production and consumption. And it was already underway in the 18th century.
Yeah, you had, there's a quote I wanted to throw out there and just get your sense of, if in here it says, Gail Johnson, the prominent agricultural economist, quoted in 1974 in his damning evaluation of the American sugar program, the protectionist US quota system, that humanity's sweet tooth is just only marginally based on old cultural traditions and overwhelmingly caused by high level of protection for what is generally acknowledged to be a high cost industry. Sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and other bulk sweeteners are massively present in branded, heavily marketed food and beverages. Most consumers are unaware of the full extent of sugar's presence. Cigarettes, for example, contain sweetened tobacco, first produced by Reynolds just before World War I, and was blended into their Camel cigarettes to make it easier to inhale nicotine deeper into the lungs. Right? I mean, it's just amazing to me. You know?
Yeah, this is a horrible story indeed. And I think what Gail Johnson said, I found it so true. When I was, as an historian, of course, he's quite well-known and reputable economist, that in Europe in the 19th century, we already see that governments are struggling with the question how to get rid of their beet sugar. We have an overproduction of beet sugar, and how to get it into the consumer market. And that they design all kinds of tricks to do so. So they may have advertisements with sugar gives energy. They put sugar in the rations of soldiers to make them endure more and longer days in the battlefields. So all these things are done in the course of the 19th century, the early 20th century, to make people accustomed to a higher level of sugar intake. And that, in addition, of course, come the beverages. For the United States, this is a particularly interesting story because the beverages, sweetened beverages, are replacing the alcoholic drinks, which are becoming increasingly banned in the early 20th century. So the sweetened beverage become a substitute for the alcoholic drinks. And so one problem is solved, but another problem emerged at that time. So this is not, and I really admire Sidney Mintz, but I think that he stresses the innate taste for sweetness, whereas I would say it's, of course, people like sweet stuff, but people get accustomed to ever higher levels of sweetness, and this is a result of how our food industry functions. So this is indeed, as Gail Johnson said, this is really thrown upon us, and at the expense of the taxpayer, at the expense of our health care system, which has to cope with obesity. So this is really something which is not, I think, culturally or kind of, well, organically part of our human existence.
I remember reading, I think at one point maybe it was Michael Pollan, but he was talking about how it took the cola industry somewhere around 30 years of small but aggressive marketing in Italy to get people to, because primarily at meal times you would have either water or wine. You would have cocktails or you would have water. And it took them 30 years. They knew they had to branch into this market, but they knew it would also take a long time to push into the Italian sort of food market. But this generation of kids are the first generation of kids who are having sodas with their meals. And that's a huge success. It's a win for them. You have this established culture that is very hard to move. And, but they have this long game of like 30 years where they're like, all right, well, we can upend a culture. It's just not going to happen overnight. It's stunning to me.
Yeah, that's what happened in the Southern Europe. And sugar took, from the 18th century onwards, we can see that sugar took a long time to conquer markets in southern part of France because people had grapes. They had enough sweetness, but a milder type of sweetness, of course, than pure sugar. And it was only over time that people got accustomed to sugar. So what you see in the late 18th century is that the people in Paris already consumed a couple of kilos of sugar per year, per annum, which is quite a lot for these days. Whereas the countryside, it was perhaps 50 grams. I mean, this is a huge discrepancy. And when in the course of the 19th century, people from the countryside of France came to Paris, they were not used to consume sugar. They didn't like it. They thought it was effeminate. It was not what sturdy guys from the countryside should do. They had their own food items. So this is what happens indeed over time. Consumption patterns had to be changed, and this is what happened in the course of the 19th century, and what we still see very much see today. Now, the challenge, of course, for governments is to bend the course and to go in the opposite direction, and to get people from the sodas and the sweetened beverage to water again. In some cases, that's difficult because the case of Mexico, which has a severe obesity pandemic, severe cases of overweight, children drank cola or other beverages for breakfast because there was no clean tap water. Mm-hmm. So in many cases, many parts of the world, these sweetened beverages are keep you healthy in a way. So it's not very easy in those cases to change consumption patterns. So it requires indeed a change of food consumption, of drinking patterns, to improve our health and to get rid, or to at least to conquer the obesity pandemic, which is now going on.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more difficult is the fact that these packaged and mass-produced food items, and beverages are part of them, are much cheaper to produce than, for example, strawberries, which had to be plucked one by one. So that's expensive, or apples or pears, or everything which is healthy is often expensive, because more expensive than what is unhealthy. So this is what the conundrum we are now in, I think.
Yeah, Michael Moss's book, Sugar, Fat, and Salt, actually kind of talks about, he has one story in there where it was a head of marketing for Pepsi, and they had a new division that was trying to work its way into Brazil, into some of the poorest districts in Brazil, and the favelas, where kids are living on less than $1 a day. And so they had invented I don't know, it's like 6-ounce Pepsi that they could sell, that they were trying to market to these children, and this guy just couldn't do it anymore. They could have rice and beans, they could have something else, but they considered this to be a new market. There was a documentary called El Susto that had come out, that talks about the level to which Pepsi and Coca-Cola had taken over a lot of Mexican culture, invented ways of getting into quinceañeras, and very, very like seminal moments in people's lives, to sort of start to associate their beverages with those moments of moving into womanhood or into manhood and all of that stuff. I mean, it sounds like Vicente Fox, who was the CEO, one of the head of what was it, Coca-Cola, became the president of Mexico, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely one of those things where I wanted to kind of move a little bit into, so where are we today? What is because over the course of the 21st century, we have started to see a pushback against the level of sugar consumption at its height. We in America, I think we're at about 150 pounds of added sugar a year per child. We have an obesity epidemic, and even among children, but adults, I think we're 85% of us are metabolically unhealthy. We are starting to see some level of sort of pushback against all of this stuff. One of the interesting parts of your book that you go into is some of the sugar cartels that have had enormous influence on directing policy, that give to both sides of the aisle, especially in politics, because it really doesn't matter to them. It's about just having their influence on what we talk about when we talk about healthy futures. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it is. It's a mixed picture. On the one hand, you see that sugar companies, and also, of course, we have to include now also the corn producing regions in the United States, because they produce the high fructose corn syrup. So the beet sugar industry and the corn sector are now united, and they are very powerful in the United States. Of course, their policy is to protect the American market against the imports from Brazil. So even if we would stop protecting, or the United States would stop protecting the sugar producers in the United States, the Brazilian sugar would come in. So there's so much sugar in the world that eliminating part of the sugar industry would not solve the problem, I think. So what can be done? I think that's a sugar tax is, of course, an important mechanism. It has proven its value already in the 19th century in Germany, because there was a sugar tax and consumption was rather limited compared to, for example, Britain or the United States. We see it now in Mexico. We see it in some places in Europe. And you see that many governments are still reluctant to impose a sugar tax precisely because the power of the sugar industry. But I think this is something which needs to be done. So but that would only be a first step. There are other developments. One of the most foremost sugar producers in the world, Tate and Lyle, is a British company which went big and was fostered during the heydays of British Empire in the early 20th century. Became big in the Caribbean region, was a cane sugar producer, became one of the largest sugar producers and one of the largest molasses transporters in the world. It switched for the past 20, 25 years to artificial sweeteners. So this is what they did. And they now advertise themselves as a company that helps with non-caloric sweetener solutions. So they see that the times are changing. And indeed, as you said, the sugar consumption in most of the wealthiest countries is already slightly bending down, not in the United States, I think, but in European countries. You can see a slight bending down of this curve, but it doesn't go fast enough. So your question about where are we now? Well, there's an obesity pandemic going on. About 40% of the United States population is obese. We don't have the time to wait for this curve to come down to the 20 kilos where it should be. So we're now in the United States at 60 kilos per year per person. In Europe, 40 kilos. Many other countries is 40 kilos as well. So it means to halve sugar consumption, it requires quite drastic measures. And if they are not taken, we will have a tremendous problem at our hand because our healthcare systems will simply collapse, I think, in the coming decades.
Yeah, I remember talking to somebody who'd been focused on this for a very long time, and he had a conversation with one or two members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sort of the military, sort of, the really upper echelon of that. And they were dealing with recruitment rates because really, for the most part, recruitment rates are down primarily because most people can't pass the weight limit or the exercise limit for U.S. For the U.S. military. And we talked about this close to a decade, Ulbe, so this was a while ago. But you see the sort of them dealing with the issue in and of itself, but then you see the complete sort of start to move over in transformation of the military towards robotics, because they're like, we can't deal with the US's problem. So like, you can't fit into the tank anymore, but we'll just mechanize the tank and we'll just we'll robotize it. So I mean, I look at what Mexico has done. I think a lot of it is marketing towards children. They have tried to remove a lot of that stuff, to remove the characters, the advertisement, the culture of marketing to children, which the FCC here has tried to do, failed in the 80s, failed in the 90s, and even within Michelle and Barack Obama's presidency, when they sort of set up their Let's Move program, they asked for voluntary participation from the soda industry and the processed food industry, which never really had any intention of changing anyway. So I'd see, for me, a lever to change would be sort of starting to remove some of that stuff from every single element of childhood, in whatever way that seems reasonable at this point.
Yeah, the problem is with commercial television, commercial broadcasting, it's very difficult to accomplish that. And people will, of course, point to the First Amendment that you are free to advertise stuff. So there's a lot of, and people say, well, there's a kind of tutelage, and we are not toddlers, and the parents can decide for themselves, and so on and so forth. So this is of course, I think in a couple of European countries seriously considered to ban the sweetness and candy advertisements from the television before 8 o'clock in the evening, something like that. And that's of course it is, and we have to realize that how we got here was precisely because of advertisement. So how we get back to normal is also by taking on the advertisements. So the vending machines that entered the schools, for example, banned them from the schools. And that is something which is already ongoing for decades. And medical doctors are propagating the ban of bad food from schools and the introduction of healthy food at schools. But the point is that we as academics, and I'm an academic like a medical doctor, we do not have the means, we don't have the funds to advertise our thoughts as the beverage industry, the food industry do. So they have massive funds to do the advertising. And they see the need to advertise because they know that they are under public pressure, that they know that people are making podcasts about this kind of issues, that the newspapers are writing articles on it. Some concerned politicians want to talk about this. So they're pushing back. And that's exactly what we see in this whole history of sugar. And in fact, this is something which already happened in the 18th century when the British Quakers, this religious denomination, society of Quakers, wanted to stop the consumption of slave sugar, that the slaveholders pushed back in British Parliament. They created their own lobbies and they were very powerful. And they succeeded in postponing the abolition of slavery by a couple of decades. So this is what we see now. We will see postponement. We will see a sugar industry that will sow confusion. We will see a lot of advertisements still ongoing about beverages which are a delight and perfectly compatible with, move your body kind of campaigns. But in reality, of course, you grow fat because of the sugary waters. And this is really a problem. It goes to the root of our societies. It goes to a root of our consumption society. Where consumption is something which makes you happy and which makes you feel good. And the advertisement industry, of course, has become very sophisticated and appealing to people. Yeah, and even if irrationally we say it's nonsense, of course, you ask people that most of the advertising is nonsense, but still it sticks somewhere in your head that it's nice, it's pleasure giving, etc., etc.
Yeah, I mean, they're studying the same things that everybody else is studying, the neuroscience, the understanding of how the mind works. So your capacity for making decisions, healthy decisions over the course of a very stressful 8-hour, 9-hour workday. They know there's a certain point where you're going to get a reward. And if they're there at that time, that'll be the reward that you seek. Yeah, I remember El Susto had an interesting statistic. They said the Robert Wood Johnson spends about $100 million a year working on childhood obesity. Science, and they do some really good work, especially on advertising to children. But the processed food industry spends $100 million within the first month of that year. You know, I mean, we're talking about at least, I think it's between $1 and $2 billion on advertising. And a lot of that is geared towards children. Yeah. And I think, you know, I'm nearly 50. I've been around long enough to kind of see the sort of level change to which, as a father in and of myself, the degree to which all of this food is everywhere and ubiquitous. You know, these were the level of cultural pressure. You know, I'll go to you know, a 7-year-old or 8-year-old soccer game, football in Europe, a football game, and the amount of calories that are given to these kids who are running around for 40 minutes, right? The juices, the candy, the donuts, and all of that stuff. You couldn't, if they ran for 3 days straight, they couldn't burn off the calories that they'll eat after 40 minutes of running around.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. And there is a lot of societal pressure to make sure that these kids are getting that their blood sugar doesn't go down. what is it? The International Lifestyles Institute, which was a subsidiary paid for by Coca-Cola and Pepsi, that tried to obfuscate the role of sugar in diets. Tried to say that all of these things are part of a balanced diet, but really pushed a lot of the science around exercise as being a lever for change, when they knew all along that it wasn't. You know.
Yeah, that's the same, of course, of all these industries. The oil industry or the sugar industry, they all face the same problem. That's they really have to fight against the common knowledge that what they're doing is not healthy or is environmentally devastating. But they still have a lot of means to fight that through lobbying, through advertising, etc., etc. That's not something which just started in the 21st century. I mean, you can see this throughout history over the past centuries. And what we can also see, and there in that respect, the sugar tells us a lot about how the food industry developed, how capitalism developed. It is a story of increasing concentration of power, of industrial power in a few hands. And that allows these industrialists to increase the margins of profit, which allows them indeed to spend lavishly on advertisement and on political influencing. So this is an important thing to recognize. And for me, it's also I'm an historian, of course. I don't need to solve every problem in the world. I also find it fascinating to see how these conglomerates emerged over the past few centuries, how they cope with that. And I can also see that the competition, the circumstances under which this production took place, well, starting in the 14th or 15th century, the 16th century, the circumstances were very, very difficult. And only the sturdiest and the most unscrupulous entrepreneurs survived and made their companies bigger and bigger and bigger, and which you see in the early 19th century, that from those companies that started at that time, in the early 20th century, only a few were left. And some families, like indeed the Van Jules, they are already in sugar for 1.5 centuries. They came from Spain. They built a huge enterprise in Cuba. They were expelled from Cuba after the revolution by Fidel Castro. They came to Florida. They start again, and are now still they're again the biggest sugar producers in the world. So this is something, and also a story of resilience, of entrepreneurship, of trying to create monopolies, in fact, to assemble as much economic power as you can. If you don't, you will be wiped out. That's what capitalism is about. I mean, this is not about a lot of nice companies in free competition, and they have kind of the Smithian world, or an agriculture Jeffersonian world of all kinds of middle large farmers producing in responsible ways. This is not how the world functions. I'm a little bit restrained in accusing individual capitalists, individual producers, or individual companies from doing things, because that doesn't solve the problem. It is systemic. It's how our world economy functions, and there's also how our world economy was able and still able to feed 8 to 9 billion people in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think for us, a lot of the study of agricultural history is centered around that. We've primarily focused on the early part of the 20th century, as industrialization had moved into the agricultural sector, mechanization and industrialization. I think the thing that really worries us in the documentary that we're working on right now is centered around this. I think the need for fundamental change in the way that we feed ourselves has created a mechanism by which these large multinational corporations they've essentially geared the conversation in their favor. And so for us, sustainability means consolidation. Efficiency means consolidation. And so a lot of the smallhold farmers, agricultural producers are sort of being sucked under by this sort of the wave of this the large farm commodities movement around the world. And I remember I was talking to a Malaysian farmer who had started a foundation that was primarily focused on that. He had noticed, he had seen a lot of farmer suicides in the place that he had grown up in. And he said the long-term cost of the commoditization of our entire food system means that people are producing more and more food, but it's all being excised to the global north, remanufactured, and then resold back to these farmers. And they're never feeding people anymore. They never feel like they're feeding people anymore. And that to us is very worrying, because I think even the UN, when it's being hyperbolic, still says about 70% of the world that is feeding the world is still smallhold farmers.
Yeah. Well, in that respect, of course, the sugar story is also a story of smallholders and of plantations and industrial sugar production. We tend to forget that in Latin America and in India, much of the sugar production is by smallholders. And it's a kind of raw, darkish sugar, which is not industrially refined. And they are resisting the onslaught of capitalist sugar production until this very day, because it's part of their agricultural cycle. So in India, they can harvest the cane after other crops have been harvested. It's part of their consumption pattern, because the people like the taste of this raw sugar, which they like much better than the refined sugar. And it's of course a nice way of keeping their autonomy, because this is a product that you can grow yourself, you can mill it yourself, small mills or small cooperatives, and you can sell it in the regional markets. Or sometimes even farther away than regional markets. As in the case in India, it can sometimes be hundreds of kilometers from where you live. So yes, there are pockets of alternative production, but at the same time, the working conditions in these traditional sugar-producing regions are not very good. So that industrial factories can offer better conditions to their workers than, let's say, the traditional sugar makers. So that's one of the things. So we cannot idealize, let's say, the smallholder production. Whereas, for example, the largest sugar-producing companies in Indonesia or in Thailand are fully mechanized. They send their huge machines into the fields, so only a few people are involved in it, and these people are obtaining nice wages. Meanwhile, of course, the environment is destroyed. I mean, it goes with complete utter disregard for ecological conditions that have to be respected. To make it sustainable. So this is what we are now in a very difficult situation, that on the one hand we want to have as much food as we can, as much calories as we can obtain from nature against the lowest possible price, to make this world turn around with 9 billion people. On the other hand, we know that there are other more responsible, socially responsible and ecologically more responsible ways of producing. And we do not know, I think, at this stage, how we get from A to B.
Yeah, I don't see that conversation happening a lot.
No, that's the problem. You can't turn the clock back, and particularly not because turning the clock back would not improve conditions for a lot of people, because the conditions were not very pleasant 500-600 years ago.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, I guess the hard part I have is the down when we started, we were talking about phosphorus mining. The downstream cost of that isn't really factored into it, and I think you make a very good argument in your book about the downstream effects of sugar dumping, so we will call it, right? The amount of sugar that is in our system, and I don't think we factor in a lot of the calculations to the ecological damage or to the human health damage of that. And I think that is something that has to be a frontline focus if we're going to talk about ecological sustainability and what makes for, you know, like this human zoo that we've created. Like what should we eat, right? Yeah, I have a friend who's always reticent about talking about the good old days because we study enough history to know that there wasn't a point where that seemed great. But I think, you know, it's definitely an interesting sort of conversation. So I want to sort of drive people to the book. The book is coming out. I'm hoping this is part of a larger form conversation that people are going to have. I'm going to send it to as many people as I possibly can. I think it's a really important discussion and sort of has been sort of obscured throughout history, I think, because you get sort of anecdotal sort of, you know, sort of thrown in, you know, people blackening their teeth during, you know, the British monarchy, sort of the level of tooth decay that was associated with wealth back then. You sort of see them as, but I don't think we understood, or nor did I understand the level to which sugar is part of the development of Western civilization. And I think this book is absolutely integral to understanding that. So thank you so much for coming on. This has been a really wonderful discussion. The name of the book is The World of Sugar, How the Sweet Stuff Transformed Our Politics, Health, and Environment over 2,000 years. Ulbe, thank you so much for coming.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.